At 0630 hours local time, a 175-pound charge detonated against the steel anchor of a pontoon bridge over Lake Syvash, and Russia's last land route into Crimea began tearing itself apart with a fuel convoy still crawling across it. The drones that placed that charge had lifted off from ambush pits barely 6 miles to the northeast. On the floating spans above it sat a column of tankers hauling close to 2,400 tons of fuel. Within seconds, a wall of black smoke climbed almost 800 feet into the gray morning sky, a fire the crossing's defenders would see from 10 miles out, long after it was too late to matter. To understand why one anchor mattered more than the entire convoy, you have to understand the bridge. The Chonhar crossing carries the R-280 highway over Lake Syvash, the narrow neck of water separating occupied Crimea from the southern mainland. After Ukrainian strikes punched holes through the fixed bridge deck, Russia stopped trusting it and floated a pontoon crossing beside it, a chain of connected sections riding on the water's surface. With the Kerch Bridge already restricted for hazardous cargo like fuel, this single fragile ribbon had become the artery keeping Crimea's tanks, trucks, and gas stations alive. Cut it, and the peninsula runs dry. Russia believed the pontoon was the safe answer, and on paper it was. A pontoon bridge is almost impossible to kill the way you kill a real one. Punch a hole through one floating section, and the engineers simply unhook it, drag it aside, slide a spare into place, and reconnect the span within hours. Every deck strike is just a temporary inconvenience. So the crews grew comfortable. They queued their trucks nose to tail and rolled them onto the floating sections in the open daylight, confident that even if a drone got through, the damage would be patched by nightfall. That confidence was the target. Ukraine had studied the same crossing and reached the opposite conclusion. Don't hole the deck. The bridge only heals from that. Instead, sever the shore anchor, the steel cables and concrete block that hold the entire floating chain against the current. Break that single point, and the river does the rest, swinging the sections sideways one after another. So they placed the charge early, pulled their heavy drone back into the smoke, and waited. Waited for the tankers to commit to the middle of the span, where there was no reverse and nowhere to run. They weren't trying to put another hole in the bridge. They were going to take the whole bridge apart with the convoy still standing on it. And the device to do it was already in place. The heavy drone at the center of this plan was not built for war. It began life as an agricultural sprayer, a 6-rotor hexacopter designed to drift over Ukrainian farmland dusting crops. Ukrainian crews call the modified version the Vampire, though Russian soldiers gave it a darker name, Baba Yaga, the witch of the folktales. The pesticide tank had been stripped out and replaced with a 175-pound shaped charge slung beneath the frame on cables, and its range pushed out to roughly 19 miles. In plain terms, it was a flying tractor carrying a bomb heavy enough to break a bridge, but that payload was also the machine's greatest weakness. Because the charge hung on cables rather than sitting fixed in the airframe, every course correction set it swinging like a wrecking ball. Each time the pilot banked, 175 pounds of explosive lagged behind on inertia and dragged the whole aircraft off balance. Fly it like a normal drone, and it would tear itself out of the sky. This was less like piloting an aircraft and more like carrying a bucket of water up a ladder. Move too fast, and the load does the deciding for you, which is exactly why the target was never the trucks. Cracking a single vehicle just leaves a wreck on the deck that engineers push aside. The pilot ignored the convoy entirely and looked instead at the joints, the locking pins and the shore anchor holding the floating chain together as one continuous strip. Destroy a vehicle and you get a burning truck. Destroy the right anchor and 200 feet of bridge swings loose on the current, dragging every section behind it out of line like a string of rafts that just lost its last mooring rope. That was the seam the Vampire was hunting. Getting there meant crossing open water past a freshly dug defensive line. Trenches, gun pits, and observation posts staring straight out at the strait. So the Vampire didn't fly alone. 10 FPV drones had launched ahead of it and torn a hole in that line first, one diving into the trench roof, another catching a gun position as its barrel was still turning, a third folding the observation post into black smoke. 6 survivors then spread out around the hexacopter as a moving escort screen, low and fast, pulling every Russian gunner's eye toward the small, screaming targets, while the big, quiet ones slid across the coastline behind them. On the Ukrainian crew's screens ran 6 live video feeds, and not one of them came from a Ukrainian drone. They were the feeds from the Russian FPV cameras, pulled out of the air and decoded in real time. Every Russian pilot was staring at the escort drones. Nobody was looking up at the vampire, and on the far bank, the Russians had stopped watching their screens altogether. They had started to listen. Here the operation nearly came undone. The vampire was hard to see, but impossible to silence. Every touch of the control stick sent a radio pulse from the ground station to the aircraft, and a Russian electronic warfare team had been waiting for exactly that. Their jammer, a system called Repellent 1, didn't try to find the drone or seize it. It simply flooded every frequency inside a 1.5-mile bubble with noise at once. When the pilot's image dissolved into frozen blocks, he did the standard thing. Switched channels. Nothing. Switched again. Nothing. You can change frequencies as often as you like, but it doesn't help when someone has turned on 100 loudspeakers on every channel in the room. The noise is already there, waiting, wherever you go. With the link cut, the vampire began drifting east on inertia, its 175-pound charge swinging free beneath it, 60 seconds from tumbling onto whatever lay below. The pilot had one option left: brute force. He drove the transmitter to full power and pushed a stronger signal straight through the jamming. The picture crawled back, stuttering but readable, and he hauled the drone back onto its approach line. He had saved the aircraft. He had also just shouted his own location across the strait, because on the other bank, 2 passive receivers called Sky Hunters had been sitting silent, listening for that transmitter. They didn't jam, and they emitted nothing for Ukraine to detect. They only measured the direction a signal came from, like caller ID for drones. It can't stop the call, but it can tell you which house it's ringing from. A moment earlier, they'd known only that the pilot sat somewhere in a wide patch of ground. The instant he cranked his power to beat the jammer, both receivers crossed their bearings on a single bunker 4 miles from the bridge. He'd bought back control of the vampire by telling the enemy exactly where to send the next round, and the 175-pound charge still hadn't been placed. Now the operation split into 2 races running against the same clock. Over the bridge, the vampire eased down toward the anchor pit where the mooring cables met their concrete block on the shore and began lowering its charge on the winch. Steady, exposed, hovering. Then tracer fire crossed the frame. A Cord 12.7mm heavy machine gun, 600 rounds a minute, from a sandbagged position 400 yards out. The first burst went low. The second walked in close. The pilot couldn't dodge. Jerk the drone now and the charge would swing out of the pit or slam into the bridge, so he called an escort down onto the gun. One FPV broke formation, dove straight into the sandbags, and the tracers stopped. The FPV didn't come back either. That was the arithmetic of the day. Every hidden gun cost Ukraine another drone. 4 miles away, the second race was closing on the bunker. Russia sent 2 FPVs not to destroy it, but to flush it, circling the roof, forcing the crew to choose between staying buried and being buried. Overhead, a reconnaissance drone orbited at altitude with its camera fixed on the entrance, waiting for a laser lock, while behind the lines a 2S-19 MSTA-S howitzer sat loaded with a Krasnopol, a 152mm shell that steers itself onto a laser-marked point in the final seconds of flight. The trap only needed the men to run. Inside the bunker, the pilot made the last move that mattered. He flipped the vampire into automatic stabilization, telling it to hold position on the last data it had, released the stick with the charge still hanging in midair, and both men bolted for a backup shelter down a collapsed communication trench. As they crossed the exposed final stretch, a whistle came down out of the sky, not the flat drone of a horizontal FPV, but a sound falling straight from above. The Krasnopol turned the old control bunker into a crater. It was a few seconds too late. Before the pilot ever let go of the stick, the final lowering command had already gone out. The winch kept feeding cable on its own, and the 175-pound charge settled the last foot into the anchor pit, coming to rest against the concrete and the taut steel holding the whole bridge to the shore. The vampire retracted its line, climbed, and slipped away down its escape route inside the smoke. Its work done, the bomb in place, and not yet lit. The convoy started onto the pontoon in the open. BMT Terminators led, cargo trucks behind them, and in the belly of the column the long line of fuel tankers, each floating section sinking and rising under the weight of every axle. This was the moment the whole plan had waited for. The charge at the anchor had been sitting there for minutes, patient, while the tankers rolled themselves into the middle of the span. Then the 5 surviving FPVs moved. 3 of them climbed hard to 300 feet, tipped their noses down and dove straight at the center of the convoy like they meant to die there. The Russian gunners reacted on reflex. The 30mm turrets on the Terminators swung up and opened fire, tearing the airspace above the bridge into ribbons. Every gun on the crossing pointed at the sky. That was the whole point. While the turrets chased the divers overhead, the last 2 FPVs dropped almost to the surface of the water and ran the shoreline so low their rotor wash streaked the strait. The drones above were a fist thrown at the face. The 2 below were the knife slipping into the ribs. 1 decoy came apart in a burst of 30mm. The second bored in anyway, dragging the turrets farther toward the center of the span, buying the low pair the last few seconds they needed. On the lead drone's camera, the anchor pit swam up through the smoke. The concrete block, the taut steel cables, and the 175-pound charge the Vampire had left beside them, exactly where it was placed. The FPV steadied its reticle over the pit and went straight down. The screen went white. The blast shattered the concrete and cut into the cables. One snapped free of its anchor. The next let go a heartbeat later. The end of the pontoon lost its hold on the shore, and the current took it, pushing the first section sideways, and the sections chained behind it followed, swinging out of line one after another like rafts pulled loose from their last mooring. A truck slid, hit the railing, and jackknifed across a floating span. The tanker behind it braked. The vehicles farther back kept piling forward because there was suddenly nowhere to stop. The second low FPV threaded the gap between 2 trucks and struck a tanker broadside. The shell tore open, fuel misted into the air, and the mist found a spark. A fireball rolled across the deck and swallowed the vehicles trapped around it. The last decoy peeled off the group above, saw the flames, and dove into a second tanker dozens of yards away. Pressure built for a few seconds, then that one went too. The shockwave swept the span, buckling tanks, spilling fuel across the pontoon sections that were already drifting apart. The fire didn't need to reach every truck. The heat did the rest, deforming valves, tearing pipes, feeding vapor from one tanker into the next. The front of the convoy couldn't turn back, the rear couldn't move forward, and beneath all of it, the bridge itself was quietly coming undone on the current. Ukraine never had to destroy the column. They only had to cut one anchor and let the river, the weight, and 2,400 tons of fuel finish the sentence. When the smoke thinned, the crossing was gone as a crossing. The floating sections drifted at angles the current had chosen, the anchor line was cut, and a stretch of burning vehicles sat stranded on spans no longer connected to the shore. Across the wider campaign that week, Ukrainian units struck the Chonhar road bridge, the rail bridge, the pontoon, and the truck columns feeding them. Roughly 50 fuel and ammunition vehicles hit near the Armyansk approaches alone. The pontoon that was supposed to heal any wound had failed in the one-way engineers couldn't patch. By nightfall, you can replace a hold section in hours, but you can't re-anchor a bridge the river has already pulled out of line while it's on fire. Militarily, that's the payoff. But the deeper damage isn't measured in trucks. It's measured in a map. The R-280 across Lake Syvash was never just a road. It was the fallback. With the Kerch Bridge restricted for fuel after years of Ukrainian strikes, this northern land corridor had become the artery keeping Crimea's fuel flowing. Every time a bridge here goes down, the convoys are forced onto longer detours through Armyansk and Decoys, where they queue, and where queued trucks are simply targets that haven't been hit yet. The fuel shortages already reported on the peninsula aren't an accident of one bad morning. They're the compounding interest on a logistics network being strangled one crossing at a time, and that's the quiet lesson under the fireball. Russia's patch, the self-healing pontoon, was supposed to be the answer to Ukraine's bridge strikes. Instead, it became the softer target, The thing built to survive the attack turned out to be easier to unmake than the bridge it replaced, because Ukraine stopped aiming at the deck everyone was defending and aimed at the anchor nobody was watching. The convoy didn't die to a bigger bomb. It died to a better question. Not how do we break this bridge, but what is actually holding it together? So here's the one worth arguing in the comments. What decided this? The swarm of decoy FPVs that pulled every gun toward the sky, or the single charge waiting at the anchor the whole time? Tell us where you land. Subscribe for more breakdowns of how these operations actually work beneath the headlines, and keep following the effort toward a just peace for Ukraine.